Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are really getting into two incredibly potent critiques of modern Western society.
We are, and they're separated by 60 years, but they are so tightly linked by this chilling theory of how history is working.
And we should be clear up front, we're not here to endorse any political positions. Our job is to dig in, to really excavate the arguments and the evidence that these texts lay out.
Exactly. We're looking at James Burnham's 1964 classic, Suicide of the West, and then fast-forwarding to today with Oren McIntyre's 2024 book, The Total State.
And the argument they both make, which is, it's incredibly provocative, is that the dominant ideology of the West, what they call liberalism, isn't just failing to protect civilization.
It's actually the engine driving its own rapid self-inflicted decline.
Burnham really, he sets the scene for this back in the 60s. He's looking around and he sees this geopolitical trend that's just impossible to ignore.
The constant retreat.
Yeah, constant accelerating contraction of Western power and influence. He points to these moments, like the loss of the Suez Canal in 1956.
Which was a massive symbolic blow.
A huge one. And at the same time, you have the expansion of anti-Western forces like global communism. He said it was like watching a film of civilization just winding backward.
And his big question is, okay, if this is happening, it's not just a minor adjustment. He suggests it's a sign that the civilization is actually dying. So why? Why is the West, especially the U.S., just letting this happen?
And his answer is the hook for everything we're talking about today. He says American liberalism is the ideology that justifies it. It's the philosophy that makes Westerners okay with the shrinking of their own world.
It reconciles them to it.
Right. And then 60 years later, McIntyre comes along and basically argues that this philosophical virus has now become an institutional reality.
He calls it the total state.
Yeah, the total state. And it's not totalitarian like Stalin, he says, but it's this centralized, unaccountable government run by an unelected managerial elite, people who operate completely outside the old constitutional lines.
So when you put the two books together, you get this unified theory. Burnham gives you the ideological software, the programming that demands decline in the guilt.
And McIntyre gives you the institutional hardware that turns that ideology into actual centralized power. The external shrinking mirrors an internal collapse of our own autonomy.
Exactly.
So that brings us to the big question for this deep dive. How do these sources argue that the very ideas we associate with progress, rationalism, equality, globalism, are secretly functioning to cause collapse and centralization?
It's a huge question. And to even begin to answer it, we have to start with their definition of liberalism.
Right, because it's a very specific one.
It's very specific. Burnham is very clear this is not about a political party. He calls it an ideological syndrome.
A syndrome.
Yeah, like a cluster of feelings, assumptions, and ideas that has become the dominant worldview, the Weltanschauung of the United States and most of the West.
He has this really great sort of common sense way of defining it. He says people know what a liberal is, the same way they know what a dog is, even if they can't give you a scientific definition.
Right. Everyone in 1964 knew Eleanor Roosevelt was a liberal. Yeah. You didn't need a list of doctrines. You knew.
So the task of these books is to take that gut feeling, that intuitive sense, and turn it into a logical framework we can actually analyze.
And when they do that, the conclusion they reach is just devastating. They argue that liberalism is basically the verbal systematization of the process of Western contraction. It's the language we use to justify and even speed up our own retreat from the world.
Okay, so to make this really concrete, Burnham lays out these key beliefs, this L list that kind of govern liberal thought. Let's start with the one that seems to underpin everything else, the role of the state.
That's the one. The absolute core is this radical move towards statism, built around what he calls the social obligations of government.
So this is the idea that the government has a duty to provide for the ill, the aged, the poor.
Everyone. If you're unemployed, if you're sick, if you're poor, and you can't care for yourself, the state has a comprehensive, permanent duty to do it for you. It's not seen as charity or a temporary fix. It's a core function.
And this duty, crucially, it doesn't stop at the border, does it?
Not at all. That's a key part of the ideology. The obligation extends globally. It demands massive foreign aid to underdeveloped countries because, if poverty is a solvable problem here, it must be a solvable problem everywhere. And the state is the only tool powerful enough to solve it.
Which has to have massive implications for foreign policy.
It completely shapes it. It moves you into this framework of internationalism and peace. Because if the state can solve all social problems, then war isn't some tragic, permanent part of being human.
It's just another problem to be solved. A misunderstanding, maybe.
Exactly, a technical glitch. And so the doctrine says the West must always be willing to negotiate with its enemies, like the communist nations at the time. The primary goal of all foreign policy has to be peace.
Even if that comes at the expense of, say, a strategic advantage.
Especially then. But you asked, how does this push for peace lead to contraction?
Yeah, how does that work?
Well, it works by making national power itself seem suspicious. Burnham notes that, for the liberal worldview, national sovereignty is this outworn concept.
Old-fashioned. Dangerous, even.
Right. If the real goal is global peace, then things like world disarmament are automatically a good thing. A willingness to give up your own power, to cede sovereignty, is seen as a moral positive, because national self-interest is framed as the root cause of all conflict.
Not the basis for survival.
Exactly. It's the ideological core that justifies retreat. If you believe your own strength is immoral, then getting weaker becomes a moral duty.
That makes a frightening amount of sense. And it connects right into the next big theme, which is this drive for egalitarianism and universalism.
It's the same logic. The core belief is that everyone, everywhere, is entitled to the same political and social rights with no distinctions. Race, property, nationality, none of it matters.
Every nation has a right to independence. Every person has a right to the same outcomes.
Yes. And this universal drive is what creates the moral basis for what was called the century of the common man. A world where any kind of exceptionalism, whether it's an individual or a whole nation, is seen as a problem to be flattened out.
Now, this entire structure, this whole syndrome, it wouldn't work if it wasn't built on a really specific philosophical foundation. And Burnham says the key is rationalism.
That's the master key, you're right. It all rests on one core assumption about human nature.
Jizz.
That man is infinitely plastic. We're not born corrupt or sinful or flawed in any permanent way. The only things holding us back from a perfect society are ignorance and bad social institutions.
So if human nature isn't the problem, then things like war and poverty and crime, they aren't permanent features of life. They're just problems that can be solved.
Precisely. They're just technical faults in the system. And Burnham says this is what allows the liberal to believe that if we just apply enough reason, enough rational science, we can solve every social ill.
So there's no need for, say, tradition or faith or intuition?
None. In fact, those things are seen as obstacles. This worldview is profoundly rationalist. It's confident that science and reason can fix the world. Everything has to be subjected to rational inquiry because all problems are, at their root, technical.
And if you're using reason to solve technical problems, that leads you straight to a secular goal, right? The ideal you're aiming for isn't in the next life, it's paradise on Earth.
It's totally terrestrial. The goal is the elimination of suffering, poverty, and war right here, right now. And because you can't have any transcendental authority getting in the way of this rational project.
Religion has to be pushed aside.
It has to be strictly a private affair, a solid wall between it and the state. This makes sure that old ideas about morality or sin can't put any limits on what the state can do to perfect society.
So the whole ideology, by its very design, it just demands more and more centralization.
It has to. If you believe perfection is possible and reason is the tool, you have to empower the one institution that can apply that reason across all of society. And that's the state.
You know, the word liberalism is so confusing today because it used to mean something almost totally opposite.
Oh, completely. If you look at 19th century classical liberalism, John Stuart Mill, the highest value was absolute freedom, a strictly limited state.
But Burnham argues modern liberalism is a total inversion of that.
It's a complete shift in the value hierarchy. The new priority list, he says, consistently puts peace and justice way above freedom and liberty.
Freedom becomes secondary, or even an obstacle.
Yes, an obstacle to achieving certain social goals. And the biggest example of this is prioritizing justice over freedom.
By which they mean social justice.
Right. The relentless drive to eliminate all forms of social discrimination, that becomes the prime directive. But the authors argue that this mission is, by its nature, destructive to individual freedom.
How so? What's the trade-off?
Well, to get rid of all perceived discrimination, the state has to restrict what you can do in your private life. Burnham gives these really practical examples, like the freedom to hire whoever you think is most competent versus having to meet a quota.
Or the freedom to choose your neighbors or who you associate with.
Exactly. The ideology says that the goal of ending discrimination is so important that sacrificing these, genuine personal freedoms is a price well worth paying.
And you see this in the economic sphere too, right? With things like Social Security.
Absolutely. If the goal is social welfare, the state can't trust you to provide for yourself. You might fail. So even if you want to provide for your own retirement, it doesn't matter. The state demands 100% compliance.
Because it's a status system. It has to be universal to work.
It must be. And this wasn't an accident. This move towards statism triumphant was a conscious intellectual project. Thinkers like John Dewey argued that the state must be used as the primary tool for social reform.
And as that idea took hold, the people who believed in it moved into positions of power.
Right. They moved into the executive branch, into the permanent bureaucracy. And as Burnham points out, once you're running the state, it's pretty hard to distrust it or want to limit it.
You're not going to limit your own power.
Why would you? The executive branch becomes the engine of progress, and Congress, the legislature, starts to look like this slow, archaic, obstructionist thing getting in the way.
But this is where the internal contradictions really start to show. Burnham calls it the double standard, a kind of selective indignation.
Yes, and this is where you see the core function of the ideology, which is to justify Western contraction.
Okay, break that down. The argument is that the modern liberal finds their eternal enemy always on the right.
Always. There's immediate, sustained outrage over any violation of freedom or justice by conservative or nationalist groups.
But when similar, or even much worse, things are done by groups on the left.
The protest is, as he puts it, much muted. He gives these stark examples from the 60s. There was massive global outrage over French military actions in Algeria.
Okay.
But the terror carried out by Arab groups, which caused far more casualties over a longer period, received almost no sustained protest from the same quarters.
So it's about who the perpetrator is, not the act itself.
It seems to be. And he says you could see it domestically, too. Certain groups could preach racial hatred and violence with never a challenge from civil liberties groups, as long as they were aligned with the political left.
So what's behind that? Why the double standard?
It comes down to what he calls a sympathy for the left. Deep down, liberals don't see communists or radical socialists as true enemies. They see them as people with the correct ideals and goals, but wrong methods.
Because they share that same end goal, the secular egalitarian utopia on Earth.
They share the goal. And that ideological overlap makes it really hard to fight decisively against the left because, as Burnham writes, the liberal dimly feels that in doing so, he would be somehow wounding himself.
And that sympathy has to have disastrous effects on foreign policy.
It creates what he calls an ever-increasing softness. You see the whole trajectory of U.S. foreign policy shift from the firm doctrine of containment in the early Cold War.
Right, from 47 to about 56.
To a new policy of coexistence, collaboration, and even actively supporting anti-Western neutral countries after 1956.
And nothing shows this better than the case study of Suez versus Hungary in 1956. This is a critical moment.
It's the perfect historical laboratory. It reveals the ideology in action.
So let's set the scene for the listener. In October of 56, two things happen at almost the same time. The Soviet Union brutally crushes a genuine freedom revolt in Hungary,
Killing thousands.
and at the same time, America's closest allies, Britain, France, and Israel, intervene in Egypt to take back the Suez Canal.
And the U.S. response to these two events is just absolutely revealing. In Hungary, the U.S. does nothing. It avoids any confrontation with the Soviets. The whole doctrine of liberation for Eastern Europe, gone. Abandoned.
But with Suez.
With Suez, the U.S. intervenes aggressively against its own allies. It puts extreme economic and diplomatic pressure on Britain, France, and Israel and forces them to withdraw in humiliation.
So why? Why act against your friends but not your enemies?
Because acting against Britain and France was perfectly aligned with abstract liberal ideology.
The renunciation of force, non-interference with underdeveloped nations.
Upholding a single law for all nations. The ideology made it easier to confront your allies than to confront the actual communist enemy. And that chillingly proved that the U.S. was prioritizing its abstract ideology over the actual geopolitical interests of the West.
And this softness even infected military strategy, didn't it? Burnham talks about deterrence theory in these liberal think tanks.
Yeah, he says it often operated as a gigantic bluff. The idea wasn't to actually be prepared to use the nuclear arsenal. It was just to make the other side think you might use it.
Which is a strategy that comes from a deep ideological recoil from the serious use of power.
A recoil from what's necessary for survival.
Okay, so that's the ideology, that's the software. Now we shift to McIntyre and the modern analysis. If liberalism is the virus,
Then the total state is the body's response that ends up consuming the host.
McIntyre starts by kind of redefining power. He says, look, historically, all small states were total in a way because everyone had to work for survival, but the modern state is total in a completely new way.
It's total because it has grown by systematically destroying every other source of social authority.
Which brings us to this critical idea of the lie of liberation.
This is so important. The public today feels like we live in an age of incredible freedom, right?
Of course.
But McIntyre argues it's because the state has liberated us from all our traditional obligations. The duties you had to your extended family, the moral authority of the church, the economic rules of a guild, all gone.
There's a quote he uses from Bertrand de Juvenel that makes this exact point. People feel free when their obligations to local authorities go down.
Even as their obligations to the central political authority, the state, are going way, way up.
So you're trading these local, personal, face-to-face relationships for this anonymous, total dependence on a distant central power.
And it feels like freedom. If the state takes care of my aging parents, educates my kids, and guarantees my income, I feel free from those burdens. But I've surrendered my agency to the system.
Which brings up the big American question. Why didn't the Constitution stop this? It was designed to prevent this exact thing.
McIntyre says the core problem is that we all, kind of, accepted a noble lie. There's a comforting idea that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights are these magical pieces of paper that will protect us forever.
When in reality, the government has been ever expanding.
Right. The Founding Fathers knew the paper wasn't enough. John Adams famously said the Constitution was made only for moral and religious people and would be wholly inadequate for anyone else.
So when the shared culture, the shared morality and faith that holds everything together starts to erode,
the Constitution loses its context.
Oh.
The gears of government still turn, but they're not connected to anything real anymore. They can be easily bypassed.
And what about accountability? Liberal democracies are supposed to be all about checks and balances, but McIntyre says the total state is unaccountable.
This is where he brings in the political theorist Carl Schmitt and his idea of sovereignty.
Okay.
Schmitt's definition of sovereignty is simple. The sovereign is not who makes the laws. The sovereign is whoever gets to decide on the exception.
The moment of crisis when the normal rules don't apply.
Exactly, like a pandemic. Someone has to make the final call. And the genius of modern liberal democracy for the ruling class is that it hides who that is. It dissipates accountability across this vast, faceless, credentialed bureaucracy. No one is ever really responsible.
Which means the people actually running things aren't the politicians we elect. It's the managerial class.
It's the managerial class and what he calls the Cathedral. This gets us into the work of Vilfredo Pareto and his theory of the foxes and the lions.
Right, the two types of ruling elites.
Pareto says you need two traits in a ruling class. The lions, who rule by force and direct authority, and the foxes, who rule by cunning, manipulation, and deceit.
And the argument is that modern society, with its complexity, its bureaucracy, its global finance, it just massively favors the foxes.
It does. A simple martial lion can't run a modern regulatory agency or a central bank. The system selects for the highly credentialed, manipulative fox.
So our managerial elite is full of these foxes, but how do they all coordinate? They're scattered across government, media, universities, corporations. There's no central committee sending out orders.
And this is McIntyre's brilliant concept, the cathedral.
It's the consensus-making machine.
It's the decentralized apparatus that acts like a modern church. It sets the moral code, which is progressive liberalism, and it achieves consensus without conspiracy.
How?
No secret meetings are needed because the elites all spend years at the same handful of educational institutions, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, during their most formative years. To succeed in that world, you have to learn and internalize and repeat the tenets of progressivism.
So the university system becomes the new priesthood. It provides the standardized training, the moral operating system for everyone who's going to be in charge no matter what field they're in.
Exactly. So when the heads of Harvard, the New York Times, the State Department, and Google all react to an event in the exact same way.
They're not getting a phone call from a conspirator.
No. They're just running the same software. They are demonstrating the efficiency of the moral programming they all received from the cathedral.
And this whole abstract structure, it really comes into sharp focus during a crisis. McIntyre argues the COVID-19 pandemic was like the ultimate stress test.
He calls it the black swan event that showed just how fragile our constitutional protections had really become.
The pandemic gave the state the perfect reason to use its total power, and it immediately established this principle of hypocrisy as hierarchy.
Right. Think about the politicians who impose these indefinite lockdowns, who shut down small businesses and churches, who fine people for not complying.
And then just a few months later, those exact same politicians in the media were actively encouraging massive street protests and riots over George Floyd.
Even overriding their own public health orders to do so.
That was the moment. That was the demonstration of sovereignty. The message was crystal clear. If you support the progressive regime, you're a friend and you get special privileges. If you're an enemy, you get punished.
The health reason was just a pretext. It was secondary to the political goal. Rioting and looting were effectively legalized in the middle of a pandemic because the cause served the regime's narrative.
And the crisis was also used for a massive expansion of power, not just lockdowns, but the rapid non-legislative overhaul of voting systems with mass mail-in ballots.
Constitutional norms just vanished. And there was basically zero accountability for the managerial class who made these decisions.
Beyond the crisis, though, McIntyre argues the long-term goal of the system is what he calls managed dehumanization,
Which is the dismantling of any source of identity or independence that exists outside of the state.
And that starts with economics, right? With dissolving the middle class.
Yes. The total state, he argues, has to attack the autonomy that comes from owning hard property land, a home, an independent business. That was the foundation of the traditional American middle class.
And the ideology sees that kind of independence as inefficient, a threat to central planning.
It is a threat. This is the logic behind that infamous line from the World Economic Forum. You will own nothing, and you will be happy. The ideal subject of the total state is someone who rents everything, their home, their car, their food, from massive corporations that are tied into the managerial system.
Anyone who can make a living on their own outside of that mass bureaucracy is a threat to control.
A direct threat. And the next target, naturally, is the main competitor for your loyalty, the attack on the family.
Which explains the modern obsession with issues of sexual and gender identity, especially in kids.
McIntyre says it creates a reliable wedge between children and their parents. The moment a child's self-identity is defined as a human right, the state now has a duty to protect that right.
Not from strangers, but from the child's own parents.
Right. The parents become potential obstacles to the child's self-realization. So the argument for child autonomy is actually an argument for the state to assume authority over the child, to break that bond of loyalty.
That is an incredibly insidious mechanism, and it leads to maybe the most insidious of all, the therapeutic state.
This is the pseudo-religious framework that masks political control as medical compassion.
And that rationalist foundation we talked about earlier, it comes right back here. Because if you believe man is perfectible, then all social problems, crime, poverty, even dissenting political views, they're not moral failures.
They're social pathologies. They're diseases that can be cured by bureaucratic experts and scientific therapies.
So the new priesthood is the credentialed expert, the scientist, the therapist, the bureaucrat.
Exactly. The system's entire legitimacy rests on this faith that science can solve all human problems. So every state intervention has to be wrapped in the language of science and medicine.
And this allows for the ultimate form of control. This is the justification for persecution.
Yes. If someone has views that go against the Cathedral's consensus, you're not a political dissident. You're sick. You have a pathology. The state isn't crushing dissent. It's rehabilitating you. It's saving the victims of a disease.
Re-educating wrong thinkers.
Or deplatforming the carriers of dangerous misinformation. It's a profoundly modern form of control that allows the state to be absolutely ruthless while seeing itself as benevolent and compassionate.
So McIntyre paints this picture of a system that's incredibly comprehensive, but also fundamentally rigid. And because of that, it's unsustainable.
He argues it's hardwired for self-destruction. And it's because of the flawed nature of mass bureaucracy.
Which brings us to this idea of bureaucratic drift and something called Conquest's laws.
Specifically, Robert Conquest's third law. It basically says that any organization that isn't explicitly right-wing or, actively protecting its core mission will inevitably become left-wing over time and start to decay.
So social entropy is real. Without a constant defense of its original purpose, an organization will drift towards ideological purity instead of effectiveness.
And that drift is supercharged by the biggest problem of all, which is decoupling incentives.
Meaning the people in charge have no skin in the game.
Exactly. In a giant bureaucracy, the decision makers are totally insulated from the real-world consequences of their choices.
And McIntyre uses the Bud Light controversy as a perfect modern example of this.
It's a perfect example. The managers inside Anheuser-Busch were more focused on gaining social status within the progressive cathedral than they were on their actual mission, which was selling beer to their customers.
They cared more about ideological approval than the billions of dollars in market value they torched.
And that is the signature of a mature managerial class. Internal status is more important than external success. And if your ruling class is rewarded for ideological alignment instead of actual results, the whole system is doomed by design.
Because the bureaucracy has to pursue uniformity and predictability, which makes it sterile.
Utterly sterile. It becomes incapable of innovation, of producing new solutions. The main function of the total state, he says, becomes to more efficiently manage its own decline.
Rigidity is its main feature, not adaptability, which guarantees it will fail when it meets a real dynamic challenge.
And that rigidity leads to the fragility of the foxes. An elite class that is full of cunning manipulators inevitably lacks the lion traits: courage, patriotism, a willingness to use force. They become disconnected from the people and can't handle real-world threats that require strength, not just management.
And Pareto's theory would predict that this eventually triggers a violent circulation of elites.
Yes, that a new group of capable lions, people who have been locked out of power, will eventually rise up and force a sudden dramatic change when the old managerial structure finally breaks.
So if this collapse is, as they argue, inevitable, that leaves us with the final critical question. What is the path forward? How do people navigate this decay?
And the first step, according to the sources, is to stop pretending. You have to acknowledge that trying to resurrect the Constitution like some magical document without first restoring the moral and religious culture it was built on is a doomed effort.
McIntyre calls this the ghost dance.
Yeah, it's a powerful ritual that completely ignores the reality on the ground and just makes you an easy target.
So we have to reject the illusion that the institutions alone will save us. The focus has to go back to the character of the people.
You have to accept that the liberal assumption about human perfectibility has failed, and the only viable path forward is relocalization and responsibility.
Meaning you have to reverse the lie of liberation, devolve your dependence away from the state and back down to traditional local social structures.
And this is where the theory has to become practice. On the ground, this means forming strong, multi-generational families. It means restoring churches and other local associations as the center of community life.
And it means taking back personal agency over the things the state has taken over.
Which is hard. It requires sacrificing modern comfort and leisure for the difficult work of duty and community obligation.
The total state made life easier by taking away those duties. To let it atrophy, people have to choose the harder path.
They have to choose to organically rebuild those dense networks of community that define the early American Republic. McIntyre's conclusion is pretty stark. Without that choice, atomized individuals will just cling to their comfortable lifestyles and die out as the rigid state drags them down with it.
We have covered a huge amount of ground here, a really challenging deep dive. Let's just try to boil it down and summarize the most disruptive ideas we've uncovered.
Okay.
First, from Burnham. Modern liberalism functions as an ideology of reconciliation. It justifies Western retreat by putting abstract goals like justice and peace above things like national survival and individual freedom.
Second, from McIntyre. We learn about the institutional reality. The cathedral of progressive ideology coordinates a decentralized managerial elite, the foxes, by giving them all the same moral programming through education. Consensus without conspiracy.
Third, our constitutional system wasn't overthrown by a revolution. It was bypassed by collapsing the social institutions of the middle family, church, and replacing their authority with the state's. That's the lie of liberation.
And fourth, the bureaucratic total state is inherently rigid and doomed. Its incentive structures force managers to care more about ideological purity and internal status than about the actual success or survival of the things they're supposed to be running. They become efficient managers of decline.
So these sources suggest our ruling class is structurally designed to oversee decline, not prevent it. And if our leadership is made up of these foxes who are hostile to ideas of strength or tradition, and the system is designed to become as rigid as possible, what happens when the collapse they are managing finally arrives?
The rigidity means the failure will probably be sudden and catastrophic. So the final question these sources leave us with is not about how to reform the current system. It's about who is prepared. in terms of their character, their community to lead, when the current structure becomes too fragile to hold, and the current class of foxes is swept away.
It's a call to action then.
It is a call to recognize that this knowledge demands engagement, a willingness to sacrifice comfort for duty. It's about planting trees now that we may not sit under ourselves, but that are absolutely necessary for the next generation to survive. At the end of the day, that's the choice between decline and duty.